They say the cold in Cromwell Valley isn't just weather, it's something alive. In the winter of 1855, when the first heavy snow smothered the hills of rural Pennsylvania, people began hearing cries beneath the wind. They thought it was the storm at first, until they realized the voices were calling names. The same names carved into the tombstones behind the old Cromwell manor. The house had stood there for generations, windows sealed with frost no sunlight could melt, and a fireplace that never stayed lit past midnight. Locals swore the place breathed when it snowed, exhaling mist through the cracks of its frozen walls. But when the Cromwell family moved in that year, they laughed off every warning, believing curses were stories meant to scare children. Then came December. The animals froze where they stood, the clocks stopped ticking, and one by one the Cromwells began dying, not from the cold outside, but from something colder creeping within their skin. By spring, the house was empty again. Yet every winter since, the same screams return, carried on the same bitter wind, as if the family never truly left, only waited for the snow to fall again. In the year 1855, when the wilderness of Pennsylvania still swallowed towns whole and snow fell like dust from a forgotten heaven, the Cromwell family arrived at the edge of the valley. They came in a single wagon, heavy with furniture and ambition, their boots cracking the frost that had already begun to claim the earth. Thomas Cromwell, a man of stern features and sharper pride, led his wife, Margaret, and their 4 children toward the manor that locals had long since abandoned. The house stood on a hill that seemed to resist the light, its windows black, its chimneys sighing with the wind. To most, it was a ruin, but to the Cromwells, it was a promise of a new beginning. They had left behind a failing farm in Lancaster and sought a fresh start where the land was cheaper and the soil still untouched. The locals had warned them, of course. They always did. In the tavern, an old man had whispered, "The valley keeps its dead close," while another muttered about strange winters in a family that once lived in the same manor, but had vanished when the snow refused to melt. Thomas had dismissed it all as superstition, the kind of stories small towns told to keep outsiders away. Yet even he hesitated when they first reached the property and saw the frost already clinging to the door, though the air was mild and the trees still carried their last red leaves. The manor itself was an odd sight, grand but weary, with stone walls scarred by time and vines that reached toward the roof like blackened veins. A small pond rested behind it, smooth as glass and disturbingly still, reflecting the gray sky above. There was a barn nearby, its doors hanging open, and a row of gravestones behind the tree line, unmarked, leaning, and half buried in snow. Margaret shivered as she saw them, clutching her youngest child closer. But Thomas assured her they were nothing more than remnants of the past, the graves of settlers long forgotten. The children, unaware of the uneasy silence that seemed to surround the hill, ran ahead laughing, their voices echoing against the emptiness. Inside, the manor greeted them with the stench of rot and the faint whisper of wind through broken shutters. Dust hung like smoke in the stale air. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips, and the floorboards groaned with every step. Still, Margaret lit candles and set about making it a home, while Thomas inspected the walls, finding strange frost patterns along the windows despite the warmth of the fire he'd started. They looked like veins spreading across glass, branching out into delicate icy tendrils. As night fell, the valley grew unnaturally quiet. No owls called, no wind stirred. Only the faint creak of the house settling could be heard, though at times it almost sounded like breathing. The children, tired from travel, fell asleep quickly, but Margaret could not. She kept hearing faint tapping, like footsteps in the hallway above them, though everyone was accounted for. When she mentioned it to Thomas, he brushed it off, insisting the house was merely old and filled with drafts. Yet something in his eyes betrayed his unease. Before dawn, frost had spread across the inside of their bedroom window, forming a shape almost like a hand pressed against the glass. Outside, the world was still and silver, the pond frozen over entirely overnight, even though the temperature had not dropped enough for it. The Cromwells had arrived seeking a place to call their own, a place to bury their past failures. But what they found was a house that had been waiting for them, patient and silent. and though none of them realized it yet, the moment they crossed the threshold, the valley had claimed them as its own. The first snow of that winter came earlier than anyone in the valley could remember. It began as a whisper, soft flakes drifting from a colorless sky, but by nightfall the ground was buried beneath a thick white silence. Inside the Cromwell manor, the air had grown colder despite the constant fire Thomas kept feeding with logs. The walls seemed to breathe out frost, and a faint mist hung in the corners of each room. Margaret wrapped the children in blankets, insisting it was only the chill of an old house. Yet even she noticed how the cold didn't feel natural. It wasn't the kind that stung the skin. It crept deeper, seeping into their bones, leaving their fingers numb no matter how close they sat to the flames. By the third night of snowfall, something in the manor shifted. The air felt heavy, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Thomas had gone to check on the horses in the barn when he noticed the silence. No sounds of hooves, no breath, just stillness. When he opened the door, he found the animals frozen solid, their eyes clouded with frost, their bodies stiff as if they had been carved from ice. He returned to the house, pale and shaking, muttering about the cold getting into the walls. Margaret tried to calm him, but her own hands trembled as she noticed the frost crawling along the fireplace bricks, devouring the warmth as soon as the fire grew. That night, the youngest child, Samuel, complained of being cold even beneath the blankets. His lips turned blue, and when Margaret touched his skin, it burned her fingertips with an unnatural chill. Thomas rushed to fetch more wood, but when he returned, the fire refused to catch. Every spark hissed and died as though the air itself rejected warmth. By morning, the house was silent again. When Margaret entered Samuel's room, she found him lying still, eyes wide open, a faint smile frozen on his lips. Frost had formed across his skin in delicate white veins, and though his window was locked from the inside, snow dusted the floor beneath his bed. Thomas buried the boy behind the manor, his shovel striking the frozen earth with dull, heavy sounds. The ground gave reluctantly, almost as if it resisted letting go of what had been taken. The remaining children watched from the steps, shivering, their faces pale and frightened. That night, Thomas ordered everyone to stay close, refusing to let the fire go out, but sleep still came for them in uneasy fits. Near midnight, a scream tore through the silence, Margaret's voice, sharp and strangled. When Thomas reached her, he found her standing before the bedroom door of their eldest daughter, Clara. The room was locked from the inside, and no sound came from within. When he finally forced it open, the sight froze him in place. Clara lay in bed as though peacefully asleep, but frost clung to her eyelashes and hair, her breath long gone. The air around her shimmered faintly with cold, and the frost on the window pane had formed the shape of her outline, as if the cold itself had captured her last moment alive. The townsfolk who came days later spoke of the impossible cold in that house, how their own lanterns dimmed when they entered, how the floorboards seemed to hum beneath their boots. Thomas, now hollow-eyed, insisted something was in the house, something that fed when the snow fell. He spoke of hearing voices whispering his name in the dark, of footsteps pacing the halls though every door was locked. But the townspeople left quickly, crossing themselves as they went, and when the next snowstorm came, no one returned. By the end of the week, another window had frosted over from the inside, and another Cromwell was gone. The family had come to Pennsylvania to escape their past, but with each snowfall, it became clear that the cold was not weather at all. It was a hunger, and the Cromwells were its chosen feast. As the deaths inside the Cromwell manor continued through the long, merciless winter, the valley below began to change. The once friendly townsfolk who had greeted the family months earlier no longer spoke their name aloud. A thick layer of unease settled over the village, spreading faster than the frost that now crept down from the hill. Every night, the wind carried strange sounds, soft crying, the creak of wood, and the faint rhythm of footsteps across the frozen pond. At first, the townspeople dismissed it as their minds playing tricks in the dark. But soon, too many had heard the same thing for it to be imagination. It wasn't just the sounds. On nights when the moon shone brightest, people began to see shapes moving near the Cromwell estate, figures pale as the snow, walking slowly across the frozen pond in single file, vanishing when the wind picked up. Those who had known the family swore they recognized the shapes. One villager, a hunter named Elias Ward, claimed he saw a small figure kneeling by the ice, the outline of a child's body. He had turned away for only a second, and when he looked back, the figure was standing upright, staring at him with eyes that caught the moonlight like shards of glass. He never went near the valley again. Rumors began to crawl through the taverns and market stalls. Some said the Cromwells had angered something ancient, a winter spirit that claimed a toll each year. Others whispered that the family had never truly died, that the house itself preserved them, keeping their souls wandering until spring thawed the land. A few believed Thomas Cromwell had made some sort of bargain, trading the warmth of his bloodline for wealth or survival. Whatever people believed, one truth remained certain. Something unnatural lingered in that valley. No one dared travel the northern road that passed the estate once the first snow fell. Carriage drivers refused to take passengers near the hill, even in daylight. By late January, the manor appeared abandoned again. The chimney released no smoke, the windows stayed dark, and the snow around the property remained untouched by footprints, as if the wind avoided that place altogether. Yet those who lived nearest swore they still saw movement inside. Candlelight flickering behind frost-covered glass, shadows crossing the curtains, though no human could be living there anymore. At night, when the wind shifted just right, a faint melody drifted down from the hill, like the sound of a music box winding itself over and over again. Children were warned never to wander near the pond, but a few curious ones claimed to have seen faces beneath the ice, clear as reflections, pale and watching. The townsfolk who dared speak of it called them the waiting ones, frozen souls, repeating their final moments. The fear grew so strong that even the church refused to hold services after dusk. The pastor once visited the valley to pray over the graves behind the manor, but when he returned, his hands were raw and blistered with frostbite despite wearing gloves. He refused to say what he saw, only murmuring that the graves weren't empty. Some nights, the snow would glow faintly blue near the Cromwell hill, and a light mist would curl upward like breath escaping the ground. The villagers shut their doors tight and kept their fires burning high, pretending not to hear the sounds from the distance, the hollow knocking, the faint laughter, the echo of voices calling names that belonged to no one living. It was as though the Cromwells were still there, repeating the life they lost, walking their endless path across the frozen pond, each winter pulling the town a little closer to their fate. One crisp morning, as the frost still clung to the valley like a stubborn shroud, a local farmhand named Samuel Harker was sent to dig a well near the outskirts of the Cromwell property. He had been told it would provide fresh water for the livestock, but as he dug deeper into the frozen earth, his shovel struck something hard. At first he thought it was rock, but the shape beneath the soil was angular, unnatural, almost deliberate. Brushing away the dirt with gloved hands, he uncovered a wooden lid, blackened with age, and the faint scent of decay wafted upward, prickling his nose and throat. Trembling, he called the others from the farm, but by the time anyone arrived, Samuel had already pried open the lid. Inside lay a small coffin, the wood cracked and splintered, yet intact, as though it had been placed there deliberately and sealed with care. The name Cromwell was engraved crudely on the top, the letters swollen and warped by time, and a cold wind seemed to escape from it as the lid moved, brushing against the shovel like exhalation. As the news spread through the town, fear settled heavier than any snowstorm. Villagers gathered, eyes wide, whispering among themselves, but no one dared touch the coffin. More graves were discovered beneath the thin layer of frost, each containing a coffin marked with the same family name. Some nearly rotted through, others preserved as if the wood itself had resisted the passage of years. They were all buried in a hidden formation, as though the Cromwells or someone before them had anticipated that future generations might come searching. The discovery shocked the town, not because they doubted the deaths of the Cromwell family during the winter, but because the sheer number of graves suggested something far older, something far more sinister. Every coffin held a member of the family, though the ages and time of death varied, indicating that this pattern of buried Cromwells had repeated for decades, possibly centuries. Some speculated that the valley itself had claimed them repeatedly, storing their bodies beneath the manor to mark a chilling continuity. The discovery of the graves only intensified the town's unease. Those who had once dismissed the winter deaths as tragic accidents now whispered about curses and bargains made in shadowed corners of the manor. The unmarked graves revealed a pattern, a cycle that no ordinary disease or misfortune could explain. Samuel, pale and silent, could not shake the feeling that the coffins were only the beginning. He reported seeing small signs in the snow afterward, footprints that did not belong to any living person, lingering shadows at the tree line, and the faint outline of figures staring through the mist. Nights became longer and heavier. Even when the wind ceased, there was a sound beneath the frost, a tapping, like the rattle of bones, echoing from the frozen ground. The journals of local historians, dug up after the discovery, hinted at the Cromwells' presence in the valley long before the current family arrived. Town records described a manor abandoned after a series of winters in which nearly every Cromwell had perished, only to have a new generation appear a few decades later. It was as if the valley had preserved their bodies in secrecy, waiting to release them into the frost again. Some villagers began leaving offerings near the pond or along the path to the manor, small candles, food, scraps of cloth, in hopes of appeasing whatever force lingered beneath the surface. But the ice and wind seemed to ignore these gestures, and the graves beneath the soil remained untouched, silent, as though holding a secret far larger and colder than any living person could comprehend. Even with the coffins revealed, no one could explain why the Cromwells had been buried there, or why the pattern continued with each new winter. The valley had become a place where the line between life and death blurred, where the frozen earth seemed to keep its own records of the family's suffering. And as the townsfolk realized the truth, that this was no ordinary burial ground but a hidden vault of the past, they also realized the chilling possibility that the Cromwells were never truly gone, only waiting lying in their coffins for the next winter to draw them back into the cold. Months after the shocking discovery of the hidden graves beneath the Cromwell manor, Eleanor, the last surviving daughter of the family, stumbled upon an old dust-covered journal in the attic. The journal had belonged to her great-grandmother, a woman whose name had been whispered only in fearful tones by the townsfolk. Eleanor blew the thick layer of dust off the leather cover, revealing an intricate design, frost-like etchings curling across the surface as though the cold had been imprinted into it. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, and immediately the air in the room seemed to grow colder, the candlelight flickering despite the absence of any draft. The first pages were filled with mundane notes, the planting seasons, the sale of livestock, and observations about the weather. But as Eleanor read further, she found entries that described nights unlike any she had ever experienced. Nights when the snow fell heavier than storms warranted. Nights when her ancestors had heard voices whispering in the darkness and seen shadows cross the frozen floors. The handwriting grew more frantic with each passing page, a mix of fear and resignation, as though the writer had known the truth but could do nothing to stop it. The most disturbing revelation came midway through the journal. Eleanor read about her great-grandmother making a pact with a presence she called the Winter Thing, an entity that existed beyond human understanding, tied to the snow, the frost, and the long, bitter cold that enveloped the valley every year. According to the journal, a Cromwell ancestor had bargained with this being centuries ago, seeking to secure prosperity and survival for the family while promising something in return, the warmth of the family itself. The journal described the terms vaguely, the language cryptic, almost ritualistic, but the implication was clear. Every winter the entity demanded a toll, taking members of the family into the cold as payment for the bounty that the Cromwells enjoyed during the warmer months. Pages detailed how previous generations had tried to resist, attempting to flee or fortify themselves against the frost, yet each effort ended in the same chilling outcome: death and disappearance. Eleanor could feel the weight of the legacy pressing down on her, the cold of the past wrapping around her heart as she realized that her own family's deaths were not random misfortune but the continuation of a centuries-old curse. As she turned the pages, Eleanor discovered accounts of rituals meant to appease the Winter Thing, offerings left outside the manor, and incantations whispered through frozen nights. Some passages mentioned witnesses, Neighbors and travelers who had glimpsed the pale, silent figures of the Cromwells walking through the snow, appearing almost as shadows stitched into the landscape. These were the same figures the villagers now whispered about, the same silhouettes seen pacing the frozen pond. The journal indicated that the entity was intelligent, observing, patient, and unyielding. It did not strike indiscriminately. It collected its due with precision, ensuring that no Cromwell could escape its grasp without consequences. Eleanor felt a chill that went beyond the cold in the room, as though the air itself were aware of her reading, aware that she now carried the knowledge that had doomed her ancestors. Some entries hinted at possible methods to break the curse, though they were fragmented and contradictory. They spoke of confronting the entity at the heart of the winter, of rituals to unbind the pact, and of sacrifices not yet made. But each attempt recorded in the journal ended in failure, often with more lives claimed. Eleanor realized that she was standing at a crossroads, inheriting a family legacy that was not just about survival or prosperity, but about a debt written in frost, a debt that could not be ignored. As the candlelight flickered against the walls of the attic, shadows seemed to move independently of her, and Eleanor understood that the presence described in the journal was not a story, not superstition, but a living force, waiting for the next winter to demand its due and ensure that the Cromwell name remained bound to the snow and ice. The night that the dead returned was unlike any before. It began quietly, as the kind of cold that seems to seep into the very marrow of your bones, slow and insidious, carrying with it a silence so deep it made the wind itself sound loud. The townsfolk had long avoided the Cromwell manor by this point, crossing themselves when they passed the hill and hurried along the frozen road, as if hurrying could protect them from what lurked atop it. But the manor had been empty for months, or so it seemed. Inside, the air hung heavy, and frost spread along the floorboards like crawling veins. Candles had long since burned out, leaving the halls in darkness. But something stirred beyond the walls, moving with a purpose that no living creature could have possessed. At the stroke of midnight, a faint tapping began on the windows, like nails struck gently against wood, but no hand was there. Then came the whispering, so soft at first it could have been the wind, yet it carried names, precise and deliberate, calling out each member of the Cromwell family. One by one, the doors opened, though no key had turned in the locks. Figures stepped into the hall, their movements deliberate but stiff, as though gravity and warmth no longer belonged to them. The forms were recognizable to those who had known the family, though their flesh was pale, almost translucent, and frost clung to their hair and clothing. Their eyes, when glimpsed in the faint moonlight filtering through the frost-covered windows, were hollow yet aware, carrying a cold intelligence that made the heart freeze faster than any winter gale. They moved silently at first, pacing the halls and rooms they had inhabited in life, retracing the steps of their final moments. Margaret appeared in the parlor, standing as she had the night she froze in her bed, the fingers of frost stretching from her skin like brittle vines. The children walked in single file, their faces calm but frozen, repeating actions long past, as if time had looped and captured them in a frozen replay. Outside, the snow began to fall again, unnaturally fast, covering footprints as if erasing the passage of anyone who dared venture near. The pond behind the manor rippled despite the ice, as though the frozen figures had disturbed some hidden current beneath. The villagers who dared glance toward the manor from the edge of the forest swore they could see silhouettes walking across the pond, figures outlined in pale blue light that shimmered in the falling snow. Some claimed they saw the youngest child lifting a hand in greeting, only for it to vanish when the next gust of wind blew. Even the animals nearby cowered, refusing to approach the hill, noses pressed against the snow as if sensing something older, colder, and far more dangerous than any human presence. Inside the manor, the air grew impossibly cold, frost forming along the ceilings and walls, spreading like living veins. Thomas's journal, left on a table, fluttered its pages as though in a ghostly breeze, and a faint hissing sound emanated from the fireplace, where no fire burned. The dead Cromwells moved through their rooms methodically, opening drawers and cabinets, brushing past objects they had known in life, touching them with icy hands. Sometimes they paused, staring at the empty spaces where family members had once been before disappearing into shadows that pooled in corners. Eleanor, who had discovered the journal of her great-grandmother months prior, realized that what she was witnessing was the culmination of centuries of the valley's claim. This was not simply a haunting, nor was it an echo of tragedy. It was a cycle, alive and precise, replaying the final moments of those bound to the winter. By dawn, the frost had receded slightly, and the figures were gone. The townsfolk, who had watched from a distance, whispered among themselves, dread settling heavier than snow. Nothing had been taken physically, yet the presence of the dead lingered, like a frozen breath in the valley that refused to leave. It was a warning and a promise. Every winter the dead would return, walking the same halls, pacing the same paths, ensuring that the Cromwell curse remained unbroken, and that the line between the living and the dead would forever blur in the endless grip of the frost. The townsfolk had grown desperate. Winter had returned with its usual cruelty, and the manor on the hill, long abandoned by the living, seemed to hum with a life of its own. The previous winters had left them fearful, but now they could no longer ignore the unnatural cold. The cries carried on the wind, and the pale figures glimpsed pacing across the frozen pond. A plan was formed in whispers, in huddled corners of the tavern, far from the frost that clawed at the windows. If the manor itself was the source of the curse, or at least the anchor for the Cromwell spirits, they reasoned that fire might end it. No one knew what they would find inside, but a blue flame had been mentioned in old journals and half-forgotten rumors, a fire that could burn through ice and shadow alike, and they hoped it would be enough to finally stop the endless winter cycle. The villagers approached at night, torches and pitch in hand, their breath rising in clouds as the snow fell thick and heavy. The ground beneath their boots was silent, the usual sounds of the forest muted by a sense of waiting. As they neared the manor, the air grew sharper, colder than any winter they had experienced. It bit at their faces and hands despite the layers they wore, and the torches flickered in strange patterns, casting shadows that seemed alive. When they reached the door, they found it sealed, as if the house itself resisted entry. With a collective effort, they forced it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and the first hints of the manor's interior greeted them, a darkness that seemed to move shadows curling along the walls, ice forming where the firelight did not reach. The villagers poured pitch across the floorboards, muttering prayers and warnings. Torches were thrown, and flames sprang to life, licking at the walls and furniture with a hungry intensity. At first, the fire behaved as expected, crackling and consuming the ancient wood, sending sparks into the cold night air. But soon the flames took on an unnatural hue, shifting from orange to an eerie, spectral blue. The heat that should have driven back the frost failed to do so. Instead, the snow outside thickened, swirling in columns that seemed almost solid, as if the storm had been summoned by the manor itself. Windows cracked as ice spread rapidly across the glass, frost-forming shapes that looked like faces pressed against the inside, watching the intruders with hollow, pale eyes. Inside, the fire roared, yet the cold persisted. Shadows moved against the walls, figures materializing and vanishing as if the manor itself were breathing, inhaling heat and exhaling frost. The villagers panicked, some retreating, others frozen in place by the sight of the Cromwell forms walking the halls once more. The children who had vanished in previous winters appeared briefly among the flames, translucent and pale, staring with eyes that seemed to pierce the soul. Each attempt to destroy the house only seemed to anger the entity that inhabited it. The blue flames danced higher, smoke twisting unnaturally, and still the snow fell, layering the land outside in blinding whiteness. By dawn, the villagers had fled, the manor a ruin, but not dead. The fire had burned everything it could reach, yet it could not melt the frost that clung to the walls, or the presence that lingered within the ruins. The pond remained frozen, its surface unbroken, and the valley was filled with a quiet so profound it pressed against the ears. Those who survived swore that even after the manor had burned, the snow continued to fall relentlessly, untouched by the warmth of fire or sun. The blue flames had vanished, but in their place, a deeper cold remained, a reminder that the Cromwell curse was far from over. Every year the same winter returned. Every year the valley echoed with the footsteps, and whispers of the dead, as though the fire had only driven them back into the walls, waiting patiently to continue their endless cycle. Even after the manor was reduced to smoldering ruins, the valley itself seemed to carry the curse forward, refusing to let the story of the Cromwells end. Winter returned with the same ruthless precision each year, and with it came the familiar, eerie signs that the family was never truly gone. Villagers who dared venture near the burned remains spoke of the snow falling in unnatural patterns, of footprints appearing and disappearing across the frozen pond, as if unseen eyes traced the paths of the dead. Shadows flickered in the blue-tinged moonlight, shapes too tall or too small to belong to any living person. Those who tried to rebuild near the manor spoke of whispers drifting on the wind, calling their names, urging them back from the edge of the ruins, before they could glimpse too closely the outlines of figures walking silently beneath the ice. Families abandoned homes, livestock refused to approach the valley, and the older villagers who had survived previous winters refused even to mention the Cromwell name aloud. Stories began to accumulate with each passing winter, tales of travelers lost in the snow who were later found standing near the ruins, pale and silent as if frozen in fear, or as if they had been marked by the same force that claimed the Cromwells. The pond remained a central symbol of the curse, its glassy surface reflecting the moon with unnatural clarity, yet beneath it, the ice held a weight, a sense of waiting. On the coldest nights, those brave enough to look claimed they saw the figures of children walking across it, hands pressed together, faces expressionless, pausing at the center as if performing some invisible ritual. And sometimes, they said, when the wind shifted, the cries of the dead could be heard. Faint, but unmistakable, calling out the names of the living as though seeking new participants in the cycle. Even the graves beneath the soil, uncovered years earlier by Samuel Harker, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The earth would heave slightly underfoot, frost patterns forming atop the coffin's surfaces that resembled frozen fingers or the outlines of faces. Villagers who tried to tend the graves found the soil too cold to dig, no matter how sharp their shovels, as though the valley itself rejected any attempt to disturb the resting place of the Cromwells. Candles left by frightened travelers melted too quickly or burned blue before extinguishing entirely, leaving only the lingering scent of smoke and ice. The patterns repeated, the cycle of the dead walking again each winter, the air thick with a cold that no fire could combat. New names were eventually added to the valley's chilling roster. Those who dared enter the ruins after the manor's destruction often disappeared, only to have their names etched in ice near the old graves the following season. Snowstorms seemed to form around these new victims, isolating them from the rest of the world, and by the time villagers found traces of their presence, the bodies, or whatever remained, were frozen in impossible positions, expressions locked in shock, terror, or awe. The valley had become a silent witness to its own relentless tradition, a place where the line between life and death blurred with each cold season. Even centuries later, the Cromwell curse endured a reminder that some pacts and debts are written not on paper or stone, but into the very air. Ice and soil that surround us impossible to escape, and every winter brings with it the promise that the cycle will continue. So if you want more chilling stories like this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.